Trapped under Antarctic ice with 10 minutes of air, what he did next shocked scientists. When the ice beneath Marcus Chin's feet cracked like a gunshot, he had exactly 3 seconds to decide whether to run or freeze, and both choices could kill him. The journey nobody believed in. Marcus had spent 18 months planning this expedition to Lake Vostok's remote northern ridge, a region so isolated that even satellite imagery showed nothing but white emptiness. The 34-year-old environmental engineer had convinced exactly 0 people that his theory was worth pursuing. That ancient geothermal vents beneath the ice shelf created microecosystems that could revolutionize our understanding of extremophile survival. His colleagues called it career suicide. His ex-wife called it obsession. His mother just stopped answering his calls. Welcome to Heartfire Obsession. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more incredible survival stories that prove human ingenuity can overcome anything. But Marcus had something nobody else had. Detailed analysis of thermal anomalies that didn't match any known geological patterns, and a stubborn refusal to believe that intelligence meant following the crowd. The first signs of danger. The expedition began wrong from day one. His guide, Victor, broke his ankle during the supply drop and had to be evacuated. The backup generator failed within 48 hours. And now, on day 6, the weather station had stopped transmitting entirely, just as the worst storm system in 30 years descended on the region. Marcus stood alone in his thermal shelter, watching the sky turn from pale gray to bruised purple. The wind didn't howl yet. It whispered, a sinister hiss that made the hair on his neck stand straight. He'd studied Arctic survival for years, but textbook knowledge felt pathetically inadequate against the primal fear crawling up his spine. The temperature was dropping faster than any model predicted. His instruments showed -42 degrees Celsius and falling. He had maybe 6 hours before his shelter's heating system would be overwhelmed. The discovery that changed the odds. Marcus made his decision then, not the safe one, but the smart one. Instead of hunkering down and hoping for rescue, he grabbed his portable thermal scanner and emergency pack. If his theory was correct, there was a geothermal vent approximately 200 meters northeast. If he was wrong, he'd die looking like an idiot. But at least he died doing something. The ice fought him with every step. Wind-driven snow pellets struck his face mask like tiny bullets. His thermal scanner kept glitching, the readouts flickering between impossible temperature spikes and blank screens. But then, through the white chaos, he saw it. A patch of ice that wasn't white at all. It was faintly gray, almost translucent, and when he knelt beside it, he could feel warmth radiating upward. The crack that threatened everything. That's when the ice spoke, that terrible cracking sound that every Arctic traveler fears. Marcus looked down. Between his knees, a hairline fracture was spreading like lightning frozen in time. The ice beneath him wasn't thick, solid glacier. It was a thin crust over something else. He had 3 seconds to make the choice. Run backward and potentially trigger a wider collapse. Stay frozen and possibly sink through when the crack expanded. Or do the unthinkable, crawl forward toward the warm spot, distributing his weight, gambling everything on his theory being right. The impossible choice. Marcus chose forward. He spread himself flat, inching across the groaning ice like a lizard on glass. Every movement sent new fractures spider-webbing outward. His heartbeat thundered so loud, he could barely hear the wind. The thermal scanner dangled from his wrist, still flickering, still showing that impossible heat signature ahead. 10 meters. 5. 3. The ice beneath his chest felt warm. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than it should be. He reached forward with one trembling hand and brushed away surface snow. What he saw made his breath catch. Beneath the translucent ice was water. Liquid water. Moving water. And in that water, something was glowing with a faint bioluminescent blue light. The realization. Marcus's scientific mind kicked into overdrive even as his survival instincts screamed at him to retreat. This wasn't just a geothermal vent. This was an entire subglacial ecosystem, thriving in conditions that should be completely sterile. The organisms below were generating their own heat through some metabolic process he'd never seen documented. But here's what terrified him more than the cracking ice or the deadly storm. The warm water was melting the ice from below. The entire sheet he was lying on was maybe 3 centimeters thick, warmed to the breaking point by the life forms underneath. The moment of truth. He needed to move. Now. But in which direction? Behind him, the storm had intensified into a white wall of fury. His shelter would be buried by now, useless. The extraction point was 4 kilometers south, impossible to reach in these conditions. But below him, under this impossibly thin ice, was warmth, was life, was possibly the only thing that could keep him alive through the next 18 hours. Marcus pulled out his ice axe with hands that barely functioned in the cold. He had no diving suit, no underwater breathing apparatus, no backup plan. Just his waterproof thermal suit, his emergency pack, and a theory that everyone said was crazy. The final decision. The ice cracked again, louder this time. A chunk the size of a dinner plate separated near his left boot and slipped into the water below with barely a splash. Through the hole, he could see the glowing blue organisms more clearly now. They looked like jellyfish crossed with ferns, pulsing gently in the current. Marcus checked his oxygen meter. The small emergency rebreather in his pack had maybe 20 minutes of air. His core body temperature was already dropping into the danger zone. The storm overhead would kill him in an hour if exposure didn't finish him first. He thought about his mother, who would never know what happened to him. His ex-wife, who would say she knew this would happen. His colleagues, who would write papers about his foolish death without ever understanding what he'd found. Then Marcus Chun, the environmental engineer that everyone called obsessed, positioned his ice axe, took 3 deep breaths, and made the choice that would either prove his genius or seal his fate. He swung the axe down hard, shattering the ice beneath him, and dropped into the impossible water below. The plunge into unknown. The cold hit him like a physical blow even through his thermal suit. But it wasn't the killing cold of the surface water. This was different, warmer, alive. The glowing organisms scattered at his entry, then slowly drifted back, curious. Marcus opened his eyes underwater and saw something that would haunt him forever. A vast cavern stretching into blue-lit infinity, carved by heat and time and life that refused to die. Thermal vents lined the floor, pumping warmth into this hidden world. And floating throughout it all were colonies of the bioluminescent organisms, creating a galaxy of living light. But his wonder lasted only seconds, because as he oriented himself in the water, he realized 3 terrible things. First, the hole he'd created was already freezing over above him, sealing shut like a closing door. Second, his emergency rebreather seal was damaged. He had maybe 10 minutes of air, not 20. And third, something large was moving in the depths below him, disturbed by his presence, rising toward him with an intelligence that no extremophile organism should possess. What Marcus Chun discovered in that moment would force him to rewrite every rule of survival he'd ever learned, if he lived long enough to tell anyone. The thing rising from the depths wasn't a monster, it was worse. It was impossible. Marcus's scientific mind tried to categorize what he was seeing through the bioluminescent haze. A mass of translucent tissue roughly the size of a small car, pulsing with coordinated rhythm, studded with what looked like sensory organs that tracked his every movement. Some kind of colonial organism, he realized, thousands of individual creatures functioning as one entity. And it was intelligent enough to be curious. The air crisis. Marcus's rebreather hissed a warning, 7 minutes of air remaining. Above him, the ice hole had already sealed over with a fresh skin of frost, barely visible as a lighter patch against the darker ceiling. His thermal suit was holding, keeping his core temperature stable, but the damaged rebreather seal meant cold water was slowly seeping into the breathing mechanism. Each breath carried a faint taste of sulfur and minerals. The colonial organism drifted closer, tentacle-like extensions reaching toward him with disturbing gentleness. Marcus forced himself to stay still, to observe rather than panic. The creature wasn't attacking, it was investigating. And more importantly, it was generating heat. He could feel warmth radiating from its mass, could see the water around it shimmer with thermal currents. That's when the idea hit him. Not a good idea, not a safe idea, but the kind of desperate ingenuity born from having no other options. The theory nobody would believe. If this organism generated heat through metabolic processes, it needed oxygen. And if it needed oxygen in an enclosed subglacial environment, there had to be pockets of air somewhere in this cavern system. The vents weren't just pumping heat. They were creating convection currents that trapped air against the ice ceiling, creating breathable spaces. Marcus looked up, scanning the cavern roof with his helmet light. There, maybe 30 meters away, a dark shadow that looked different from the surrounding ice. A possible air pocket where warm water met cold ceiling, creating a temporary bubble. 5 minutes of air left. He started swimming, slow and steady, conserving oxygen and energy. The colonial organism followed, its bioluminescent glow providing enough light to navigate by. Other smaller organisms drifted past, tube worms anchored to rocky outcrops, something that looked like translucent shrimp, entire ecosystems that shouldn't exist but did. The first air pocket. Marcus reached the dark shadow and surfaced carefully, pushing his head up through the water. His helmet light revealed a dome of air roughly 2 meters across, trapped against the ice. He pulled off his damaged rebreather and gasped, expecting sulfur fumes or carbon dioxide poisoning. Instead, the air was breathable. Thin, carrying that mineral sulfur taste, but breathable. Warm, even, maybe 5 degrees Celsius, tropical compared to the hellscape above. He hung there, treading water, catching his breath, and laughing. Actually laughing. Because everyone who called him obsessed, everyone who said his theories were impossible, they were all wrong. This ecosystem wasn't just surviving. It was thriving, creating its own atmosphere, its own rules. But his moment of triumph lasted maybe 30 seconds before reality crashed back. He was trapped under potentially hundreds of meters of ice, with no way to signal for rescue, in a cavern system that might extend for kilometers in any direction. His thermal suit would eventually fail. His body would eventually tire. And he still had to figure out how to survive until someone came looking. If anyone came looking at all. The decision to explore. Marcus pulled out his emergency pack's waterproof contents. 1 chemical light stick, a compact multi-tool, an emergency thermal blanket, water purification tablets, useless now, a signal flare, equally useless underwater, and his backup data recorder. He activated the recorder and began documenting everything, speaking in short bursts between breaths. Day 6, approximately 1,400 hours. I'm alive beneath the ice shelf in what appears to be a geothermal-sustained subglacial lake. Air pockets exist at irregular intervals. Water temperature approximately 8 to 12 degrees Celsius. Multiple extremophile species observed, including a large colonial organism exhibiting possible proto-intelligence. He paused, then added, "If you're hearing this and I'm not there to explain it, know that I wasn't crazy. I was right. And tell my mother I'm sorry I didn't call more often." The discovery of the vents. Marcus spent the next hour exploring the cavern methodically, mapping air pockets and vent locations using his helmet light and the glow from the organisms. The colonial creature followed him like a curious puppy, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly fascinated by this strange invader. What he discovered changed everything. The thermal vents weren't random. They formed a pattern, almost like a network, and the largest concentration was toward the western edge of the cavern system. There, the water temperature spiked to nearly 20 degrees Celsius, warm enough to create larger, more stable air pockets. But more importantly, there were rocks. Dry rocks. A small island of volcanic stone that broke the water's surface, warmed by direct contact with the vent system below. Marcus hauled himself onto the rocks and collapsed, shivering despite his thermal suit. For the first time in hours, he was out of the water. He was still trapped under the ice, but he had solid ground, warmth, and breathable air. He had a chance. The survival plan. Marcus's engineering mind kicked into high gear. He had resources here. Heat, minerals, water, even the bioluminescent organisms could be useful. What he needed was a way to signal the surface, or better yet, create a passage through the ice. His helmet light swept across the cavern walls, analyzing the ice structure. Most of it was meters thick, impossible to breach. But ice was a poor conductor of heat. If he could concentrate enough thermal energy at one point, create a sustained heat source, he might be able to melt through. The problem was scale. His chemical light stick might burn at 50 degrees Celsius for 12 hours, nowhere near enough. The thermal vents were fixed in place and not hot enough at the surface level. But the organisms. Marcus watched the colonial creature pulsing in the water nearby. It generated significant metabolic heat. And if his theory about their biology was correct, they were essentially living chemical reactors, breaking down minerals from the vents and converting them to energy with remarkable efficiency. What if he could concentrate them? Create a biological heat source? The experiment. Marcus spent the next 2 hours testing his theory. Using his multi-tool, he scraped samples of the mineral deposits near the vents, mostly sulfur compounds and iron oxides, and held them in the water near the smaller organisms. They responded immediately, swarming toward the minerals, absorbing them, their bioluminescence brightening as they metabolized the new food source. The colonial creature watched this with what Marcus could only interpret as interest. When he held up a larger chunk of mineral-rich rock, the creature drifted closer, extending those tentacle-like appendages. Marcus made a gamble. He climbed to the highest point of his rock island, directly beneath what looked like a thinner section of ice, maybe 3 meters thick instead of 10. He piled all the mineral-rich rocks he could find into a cairn, creating a beacon of food. Then he waited. The gathering. It started slowly. A few small organisms drifted toward the mineral pile. Then more. Then dozens. Then hundreds. The water around his island began to glow brighter as they congregated, drawn by the unexpected feast. Their collective metabolic activity raised the local water temperature noticeably. Marcus could feel the change even through his suit. The colonial creature arrived last, massive and pulsing, and when it began to feed, the water around the mineral pile literally began to steam. Marcus watched in awe as the temperature spiked, 15 degrees, 20, 25. The organisms were generating a biological heat plume, and it was rising directly toward the ice ceiling above. He could see the ice beginning to respond, not melting quickly, but softening, becoming translucent instead of opaque. Water droplets formed and fell, creating a gentle rain in the cavern. The complication. For 3 hours, Marcus maintained his biological heat source, carefully feeding minerals to the congregation of organisms, watching the ice above gradually weaken. He was so focused on his plan that he almost missed the warning signs. The water level was rising, not dramatically, but steadily. As the ice melted above, the additional water had to go somewhere. And in an enclosed cavern system, that somewhere was up. His rock island was shrinking, the waterline creeping toward his boots. Marcus did the calculations in his head and felt his stomach drop. At the current melt rate, he'd breach the ice ceiling in maybe 6 more hours. But the rising water would submerge his island completely in 4. He'd have to go back into the water, rationing his strength, gambling that he could tread water long enough for the breakthrough to occur. And if he'd miscalculated the ice thickness, if there was another layer above this one, he'd drown before he ever saw daylight. The rising stakes. As the water rose past his ankles, Marcus made his preparation. He secured his emergency pack to his belt. He stretched his muscles, knowing he'd need every ounce of strength. He spoke one more message into his data recorder. If this doesn't work, at least I'll die proving I was right. That's worth something. But if it does work, if someone hears this, understand what I found here. Life doesn't need permission to exist. It doesn't need ideal conditions or textbook environments. It needs ingenuity, adaptation, and the stubborn refusal to give up. He paused, smiled despite everything. Kind of like me. The final push. Marcus slipped back into the water as his island disappeared beneath the surface. The organisms continued their feeding frenzy, the colonial creature pulsing at the center like a living heart. The ice above had thinned considerably. He could see faint light filtering through now, either from the surface or from another cavern above. He treaded water, conserving energy, watching the ceiling. The organism's heat was creating a perfect melt channel, narrow but deep. Water streamed down the sides as ice turned liquid. 3 hours passed. 4. Marcus's legs were going numb despite the thermal suit. His arms ached. His vision was starting to blur from exhaustion and cold. And then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this enclosed world. Wind. The breakthrough moment. The ice ceiling suddenly cracked with a sound like thunder. A chunk the size of a refrigerator separated and plunged into the water, creating a wave that nearly drowned Marcus. But through the opening, he could see sky. Gray, storm-filled, hostile sky. But sky. The organisms scattered from the disturbance, their glow fading as they retreated to deeper water. The colonial creature gave one final pulse, almost like a farewell, and descended into the depths. Marcus swam toward the opening, his exhausted arms barely functioning. The hole was too high. He couldn't reach it from the water. But the falling ice chunk had created a pile of frozen debris that formed a crude ramp. He hauled himself onto the ice pile, slipping, falling, climbing again. His hands were so cold he could barely feel them. But he kept climbing, driven by pure determination and the stubborn refusal to die this close to salvation. The impossible sight. Marcus pulled himself through the opening and collapsed onto solid ice. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie calm. The sky was clearing to that particular shade of polar twilight that meant sunset was approaching. He lay there, gasping, alive, triumphant. And then he saw the footprints. Fresh footprints in the snow, leading directly to his emergence point. Human footprints. Multiple sets, with the distinctive pattern of modern Arctic boots. Someone had been here. Recently. Maybe hours ago, maybe less. Marcus forced himself to his knees, following the tracks with his eyes. They led toward a ridge approximately 100 meters away. And on that ridge, barely visible in the fading light, was a shape that made his heart nearly stop. A tent. Not his tent, not his shelter. Someone else's camp. But that was impossible. This region was uninhabited. His expedition was solo. The nearest research station was 80 kilometers south. Unless someone else had discovered the thermal anomalies. Unless someone else had come looking. Unless Marcus Chin wasn't the only person who'd been called obsessed for believing in the impossible. Marcus stumbled toward the tent, his legs barely responding to commands, his mind racing through possibilities that ranged from rescue team to hallucination. Each step felt like moving through concrete, his thermal suit heavy with ice and exhaustion. The footprints were definitely real. 3, maybe 4 different people, judging by the varying boot sizes and gait patterns. When he was 20 meters away, the tent flap opened. A woman emerged, maybe 40 years old, weather-beaten face, eyes sharp with intelligence behind glacier glasses. She looked at Marcus, showed no surprise whatsoever, and said in a thick Russian accent, "You are late. We expected you 6 hours ago." Marcus stopped, swayed, and nearly collapsed. "Expected me? Who, how?" "Dr. Petrov," she said, offering no hand, just a curt nod. "Geothermal biology, Moscow Institute. You are Chun, yes? The American engineer everyone calls crazy." She smiled slightly. "Welcome to the club of obsessed fools who are always right." The revelation. Inside the tent, Marcus found himself surrounded by equipment that made his own gear look like children's toys. Thermal imaging displays, seismic monitors, biological sample analyzers, and 3 other researchers who looked up from their work with expressions of mild interest, as if half-frozen colleagues crawled out of the ice every Tuesday. Dr. Petrov poured him something hot from a thermos. "Drink. Then explain how you survived 6 hours under the ice with no diving equipment. We tracked the breakthrough, impressive heat concentration technique, by the way. We've been trying to achieve that for 3 years." Marcus's hands shook as he held the cup. "You've been here 3 years? Not here specifically, but monitoring this region, yes. We detected the thermal anomalies in 2021, published our preliminary findings in 2022. Nobody cared except one American engineer who sent us very aggressive emails about our methodology." She raised an eyebrow. "You accused us of criminal incompetence in data analysis." Marcus felt his face flush. "I may have been enthusiastic in my critique." "You were correct," Petrov said flatly. "Our thermal readings were wrong. Yours were right. So when we detected your expedition beacon last week, we came to see if you were genius or simply lucky." She gestured toward the monitors. "You are genius. Annoying genius, but genius. The bigger picture." Over the next hour, as Marcus thawed and ate and gradually remembered how to be human, Petrov explained what they'd discovered. The geothermal ecosystem wasn't isolated. It was part of a vast network of subglacial lakes connected by channels carved through the ice by thermal currents. Some of these channels extended for hundreds of kilometers, creating a hidden biosphere that rivaled anything found in Earth's oceans. "But here is what we could not understand," Petrov said, pulling up thermal imaging data on her laptop. "The organisms generate far more heat than their metabolic processes should allow. The energy input does not match the output. It violates thermodynamics, or so it seemed. Until you saw them concentrate, Marcus said, understanding flooding through him. They're not individual organisms generating heat. They're a distributed network, sharing energy through some kind of chemical signaling. When they concentrate, they synchronize their metabolic rhythms, amplifying the total heat output through constructive interference. Petrov smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her stern face. Exactly. We theorized this for 2 years. You proved it in 3 hours by accident, because you were desperate and thought like engineer instead of biologist. She shook her head. Sometimes the best science comes from people too stubborn to die properly. The impossible question. One of the other researchers, a young man named Dmitri, spoke up nervously. Dr. Chun, there is something else. Something we have not told anyone because it sounds like science fiction. Petrov shot him a warning look, but Dmitri continued. The colonial organism you encountered. We've been tracking it for 8 months. It's not just intelligent in the way a wolf pack is intelligent. It's learning, adapting. We've documented it solving problems, even using rudimentary tools, arranging rocks to create temperature gradients, herding smaller organisms into feeding patterns. Marcus thought about how the creature had followed him, watched his experiment with the minerals, almost seemed to understand what he was trying to accomplish. You're saying it helped me melt through the ice deliberately. We're saying we don't know, Petrov said carefully. But the heat concentration pattern you achieved was too efficient, too focused. Either you are most brilliant thermal engineer in history, or something down there wanted you to succeed. The tent fell silent except for the hum of equipment and the whisper of wind outside. The ethical dilemma. We cannot publish this, Petrov said finally. Not yet. Not the full truth. You understand why. Marcus understood perfectly. An intelligent extremophile organism living beneath the ice, generating heat through unknown biological processes, potentially communicating, potentially, what? Thinking? Planning? The implications would trigger a research stampede that could destroy the entire ecosystem before they understood it. But we also cannot stay silent, Marcus countered. This changes everything we know about life's limits, about where consciousness might emerge, about whether we are only intelligent life on this planet. Dmitri interrupted quietly. Yes, we know. This is why we have been paralyzed for 8 months, collecting data, arguing, not knowing what to do. Petrov looked at Marcus with sudden intensity. So here is why we expected you, Dr. Chun. We read your papers. All of them. Even the ones that got you laughed out of conferences. You understand something most scientists forget, that intelligence is not about being safe. It's about being right even when everyone says you are wrong. She pulled out a folder, thick with documents. We need partner. American partner, for credibility and funding. Someone stubborn enough to face ridicule, smart enough to help us understand what we've found, ethical enough to protect it. She slid the folder across the table. You nearly died for theory everyone called crazy. Now we are asking, will you risk your career for truth everyone will call impossible? The choice that changes everything. Marcus opened the folder. Inside were research proposals, funding applications, NDAs, and a provisional paper titled Colonial Extremophile Intelligence in Subglacial Environments, a preliminary framework. His name was already listed as co-author. You wrote this before you met me, he said slowly. We wrote it after we read your thermal analysis, Petrov corrected, which told us you were either brilliant or insane. After today, we know which. She leaned forward. But here is real question, Dr. Chun. Everyone already thinks you are an obsessed fool who wastes time on impossible theories. If you join us, if we publish together, you will be obsessed fool who claims intelligent life exists under ice. Your career will not recover if we are wrong. And if we're right? Marcus asked. Petrov smiled grimly. If we are right, we rewrite biology, neuroscience, maybe even philosophy. But first, we endure years of mockery, skepticism, and accusations of fraud. She gestured to her team. We have done this for 8 months already. Can you handle it for years? Marcus thought about his ex-wife's warnings, his colleagues' laughter, his mother's worried phone calls. He thought about dying under the ice, convinced he was right, but having no one to tell. He thought about the colonial organism's bioluminescent glow, the way it had followed him with what could only be called curiosity. He thought about the fact that stubbornness and intelligence were only considered virtues when you turned out to be correct. I have one condition, Marcus said. Petrov raised an eyebrow. Which is, we document everything. Every failure, every dead end, every time we're wrong. Because if we're going to prove that underestimated intelligence exists down there, he gestured toward the ice. We need to show that intelligence isn't about being perfect. It's about being persistent enough to eventually be right. The new beginning. Over the next 72 hours, as a proper rescue team arrived and extracted both expeditions to safety, Marcus and Petrov's team compiled their initial findings. The process was exhausting, argumentative, and exhilarating. Every claim had to be documented, every theory tested against the data. They disagreed on terminology. Was it intelligence or just complex instinct? They debated methodology. Should they attempt direct contact or observe from distance? They argued about ethics. Did an extremophile colony have rights? Or was that anthropomorphizing too far? But they agreed on the fundamental truth. Something extraordinary lived beneath the ice, and it deserved to be understood before it was exploited. The press conference. 6 weeks later, at a joint press conference held simultaneously in Moscow and Washington, they released their preliminary findings. The response was exactly what Petrov predicted. Skepticism from establishment scientists, excitement from younger researchers, and mockery from those who'd always considered Marcus a joke. One prominent biologist called it science fiction masquerading as research. A climatologist suggested they'd misinterpreted thermal readings. A philosopher wrote an op-ed titled "The Dangers of Seeing Intelligence Where We Want to Find It." Marcus read every critique, every dismissal, every joke. And he smiled, because he'd heard it all before. The difference now was that he had data, colleagues, and proof. The validation. The turning point came 4 months later, when an independent research team from Japan, working in a completely different Antarctic region, reported nearly identical thermal anomalies and biological signatures. They hadn't known about Marcus and Petrov's work. Their research had been conducted in parallel, in secret, for the same reason: fear of ridicule. When the two teams compared notes, the patterns matched. The organisms weren't isolated to one location. They existed throughout the Antarctic subglacial system, possibly throughout all polar regions. Life hadn't just found a way to survive in impossible conditions. It had found a way to thrive, to network, possibly to think. The scientific community that had mocked Marcus began to pay attention. Funding materialized. Other researchers started admitting they'd seen similar anomalies, but hadn't dared to publish. Within a year, what had been considered crackpot theory became the hottest field in extremophile biology. The return. 18 months after his near-death experience, Marcus returned to the site with a proper expedition. Petrov's team, the Japanese researchers, specialists in marine biology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. They designed protocols for non-invasive study, ethical guidelines for interaction, and safeguards to protect the ecosystem. When they lowered remote cameras into the subglacial lake through carefully drilled access holes, Marcus watched the monitors with his heart pounding. Would the colonial organism still be there? Would it remember? Would it? The creature appeared on screen, pulsing with that familiar bioluminescent glow. And then, as if in recognition, it moved toward the camera, extended those tentacle-like appendages, and gently touched the lens. It remembers, Dmitri whispered. Or it's curious, Petrov cautioned. We must not assume. It's learning, Marcus said quietly. That's what matters. It's learning, we're learning, and maybe that's what intelligence really is. Not having all the answers, but being too stubborn to stop asking questions. The lesson nobody expected. 5 years after his expedition, Marcus Chun gave a TED Talk that went viral. Not because of the science, though the discoveries continued to accumulate, but because of what he said about intelligence itself. Everyone called me obsessed, he told the audience. They were right. Everyone said my theories were impossible. They were wrong. But here's what nobody talks about. The difference between obsession and dedication is whether you turn out to be correct. The difference between crazy and genius is whether anyone believes you before you die. He paused, looking out at the crowd. We celebrate intelligence when it's convenient, when it confirms what we already know. But real intelligence, the kind that changes the world, is usually mocked first. It's underestimated, dismissed, laughed at, Because real intelligence doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for consensus. It just keeps working, keeps testing, keeps believing, until the truth becomes too obvious to ignore. And sometimes, he added with a slight smile, that intelligence isn't even human. The final discovery. The research continues. The subglacial ecosystems reveal new secrets every year. The colonial organisms have been documented using tools, teaching behaviors to younger generations, even appearing to communicate across distances through chemical and electrical signals. Whether they're truly intelligent in the way humans understand intelligence remains debated. But Marcus and his colleagues have proven something perhaps more important, that life and intelligence exist in forms we never imagined, in places we never thought to look, achieved through methods we never predicted. And it took someone everyone called obsessed, someone everyone underestimated, someone too stubborn to let mockery stop him from being right, to prove it. The legacy. Marcus still gets emails from young scientists who tell him they were ready to give up on their theories until they heard his story. He answers everyone with the same advice. Being intelligent means being wrong a lot before you're right. Being genius means not letting the wrong part stop you from eventually being right. And being underestimated? That's just fuel. Use it. His mother finally started answering his calls again. His ex-wife sent a brief email. I still think you're obsessed, but I'm glad you were right. His colleagues at his old university invited him back for a lecture series. He declined. He had more important work to do. Because beneath the ice, in the darkness and cold and impossible conditions, life continues its patient work of being extraordinary. And somewhere in those bioluminescent depths, a colonial organism pulses with rhythms that might be thought, might be communication, might be the universe's way of reminding humanity that intelligence comes in forms we're only beginning to understand. Marcus Chin learned to survive by listening to what everyone said was impossible. He learned to thrive by proving that sometimes the most intelligent thing you can do is trust your own mind, even when every other mind says you're wrong. And that's a lesson worth surviving for. Epilogue, the message. On the 5-year anniversary of his expedition, Marcus returned to the site alone, with Petrov's permission and against everyone's advice. He descended through the access hole in a proper diving suit, with proper safety equipment, with proper protocols. He swam through the bioluminescent water to the rocky island where he'd nearly died. The colonial organism was waiting, as if it knew he'd return. It approached slowly, carefully, and when it extended those tentacle-like appendages, Marcus didn't retreat. The creature touched his gloved hand gently, and for just a moment, Marcus felt a warmth that had nothing to do with metabolic heat generation. He'd never know if the organism remembered him specifically, or if it just recognized the strange surface creature that had once shared its world. But as he swam back toward the surface, he looked down and saw something that made him stop. Dozens of the smaller organisms had arranged themselves in a pattern around the mineral pile he'd created 5 years ago. Not random, not scattered. A spiral. A shape that required planning, coordination, intention. Marcus surfaced, climbed out, and sat in the snow for a long time, staring at the ice beneath which impossible intelligence continued its patient evolution. He pulled out his data recorder and spoke one final message. To everyone who's ever been called obsessed, who's been laughed at for believing in something impossible, who's been underestimated because they saw what others refused to see. You're not crazy. You're just early. Keep going. The world needs people stubborn enough to be right even when everyone says they're wrong. He paused, smiled at the empty polar landscape. And if you're ever trapped under the ice, literal or metaphorical, remember, intelligence isn't about having the perfect plan. It's about refusing to quit until you find a way through. Marcus Chin stood, shouldered his pack, and walked toward the extraction point where his team waited. Behind him, beneath meters of ancient ice, life that shouldn't exist continued its impossible work of proving that stubborn determination might be the most intelligent survival trait of all.